Good morning. My name is Alexandra Gliszczynska-Grabias. I come from Poland, the country I'm sure you all are very familiar with, and the country which is struggling now with a rising wave of anti-Semitism, and I would like you all to really monitor what's going on in Poland and to react whenever you can, because I'm really afraid that the situation is going to be worse and worse in the years to come because of the political changes that are now taking place in my home country. But today I'm going to speak about United Nations and its attitude towards Israel in particular. So a very particular case of boycotting, discriminating and delegitimizing one particular state only is to be observed since decades in the fora of United Nations, the most important international organization in the world, established and operating, this is important, based on the principles of non-discrimination and equality of all participating states. And these tendencies are present particularly within the so-called UN Charter-based bodies, and to a lesser extent they relate to the so-called treaty bodies like the UN Human Rights Committee. The worst case is, of course, UN Human Rights Council, the successor of the UN Commission on Human Rights, which was, when still operating, equally antagonistic towards Israel. And strong hostile tendencies can also be observed, of course, among many other UN bodies, such as UNESCO or General Assembly. And exactly, at the United Nations General Assembly in 2004, the adoption of the resolution to commemorate the suffering of Jewish children caused by suicide terrorist attacks in Israel was blocked, although a very similar resolution on the suffering of Palestinian children caused by the Israelis had been adopted earlier. The draft resolution presented by Israel had to be withdrawn due to the amendments made to it by, among other states, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, who demanded that any reference to Jewish children be deleted. Anti-Semitic attitudes among many state delegations at the General Assembly are also illustrated by a statement made by a representative of Libya, and I quote, "It is high time that United Nations and the United States in particular realize that Jewish Zionists try to destroy Americans here in the United States. Is it not Jews who are abusing the American nation and try to humiliate it?" And the most significant recent manifestations of the attitudes extremely hostile and biased towards Israel include condemning Israel as the only country in the world at the annual assembly of the UN World Health Organization in May 2015, and the UN Economic and Social Council annual session in July 2015, in a resolution adopted by votes of 42 out of 54 member states, including all EU member states. As noted by the UN Watch, the mockery reached its top when Syrian ambassador took the floor to accuse Israel of facilitating terrorist attacks against Syrian cities and civilians, and to condemn the Jewish state for destroying the soil of the Golan, burning its products, and other racist policies. Now, from the very formal point of view, it is possible that a member is excluded from the United Nations for persistent violation of UN Charter principles by the General Assembly at the motion of the Security Council. There is also a procedure of suspension in the membership rights made by the General Assembly at the motion of the Security Council, in both cases by a two-thirds majority. In the case of Israel, however, such a possibility does not exist by now because of the position taken by the states sitting, some states sitting on the UN Security Council. Thus, in practice, no official law-based boycott against Israel has been implemented at the UN. However, exclusion of Israel from the groups functioning within the UN as divided by geographical criteria, a disproportional stigmatization of Israel colored with anti-Semitic hatred, application of double standards when the assessment of the observance of human rights by Israel is made, should be all considered as manifestations of boycott against Israel. One of the most direct effects of such actions against Israel at the UN is the exclusion of Israel from the works of the Asian Pacific regional group, where due to the geographical division it should belong. Arab rejectionism has ruled out Israel membership for decades. Now Israel is a permanent and full has a permanent and full membership to the Western European group, but this is not actually where it should belong. Another most evident manifestation of negative singling out of Israel is the fact that for years it has been the only country targeted in a permanent item on the Human Rights Council agenda, the famous or infamous agenda item number 7. As a result, Israel has been the subject of condemnation at every regular Human Rights Council session, irrespective of massive human rights violations occurring anywhere else in the world. The Human Rights Council session held in March 2015 brought another discussion within Agenda Item 7 and resulted, among other things, in the resolution urging all UN states to refrain from or abolish at all economic cooperation with the State of Israel with regard to the territories described in the official language of UN as occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. When the UN Human Rights Council was set up in 2006 to replace the UN Human Rights Commission, there was a general expectation that it would be much more efficient and credible in promoting universal human rights than the Commission was. Especially in the last year of its life, the Commission has been largely paralyzed due to its almost full politicization and, of course, in particular, reflected in its hostile and biased approach to Israel, as seen whenever the Middle East conflict was discussed. As a result, the issue of anti-Semitism was virtually excluded from the agenda of the Commission. Kofi Annan expressed officially his hope that the Council would not repeat its mistakes, the Commission's mistake, and will abstain from the practice of repeatedly condemning one state only, namely Israel. However, if one considers the work of the Council so far, nothing suggests that it is ready to take up the issue of anti-Semitism and place it on its agenda. To the contrary, the Council has been the stage of repeated manifestations of anti-Semitism in its most classical forms, even without any attempts to hide it under the name of critique of Zionism or the critique of State of Israel. To give a drastic example, when the representative of Syria accused Israel at the meeting of the Council in 2010 of being a state built upon hatred, discrimination, oppression, and paranoid sense of superiority, she asserted that Jewish children on school buses sometimes sing a song, and I quote the words of this song, "With my teeth I will rip your flesh, with my mouth I will suck your blood." Her hateful anti-Semitic message was acknowledged by the Dutch chair of the session with a kind "thank you." Some weeks ago, the United Nations Human Rights Council's vetting committee has shortlisted, 2 persons were shortlisted, a UK professor for a 6-year term as a special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. This is the official title of the mandate, even though she has been campaigning for the boycott of what she calls apartheid Israel and the criminal government. In the past, Professor Green, because this was the person shortlisted, compared Israel to ISIS, lamenting that the US and UK have not yet started bombing Israel for its massacres. As pointed out by one of the commentators, by recommending Professor Green to investigate a country that she seeks to bomb and boycott, the UN makes a mockery of its own selection criteria. But it is even more important to note who had been elected in the end. This is Professor Michael Ling, known to play a leadership role in numerous Arab lobby groups, including organizations which promote annual Israeli Apartheid Week events. He regularly signs anti-Israeli petitions, calls for prosecution of Israel for war crimes, addresses one-state conferences that seek to eliminate Israel as it is now, and argues that the solution to the problem must go back to Israel's very creation in 1948, which he calls the start of ethnic cleansing. And I think that electing this person is like electing a global warming denier to investigate negative effects, side effects of global warming. or to consult some of the Republican candidates about global warming in the election to follow. But let us now turn to UPR, Universal Periodic Review. An urgent need to improve the process of monitoring the observance of human rights by UN member states, which became one of the steps to reform and replace the Commission with the Council, also comprised the proposal to introduce a new control mechanism. And this mechanism has been implemented, and it is called Universal Periodic Review. And it is described as a periodical, comprehensive, and critical assessment of the observance of human rights in UN member states on the one hand, and as a formation of a forum of dialogue between states, the Council, and the government, non-government organizations on the other. The mechanism applies to all UN states, and the assessment of human rights observance should be done according to objective criteria, the same criteria applying to all states. However, in case of Israel, the UPR procedure was, of course, turned into an element of political game and continues yet another proof of the disproportionality's strong attack on one state. On one hand, the hostile attitude to Israel seems to trigger a lack of consideration for the problem of anti-Semitism, particularly during the periodic review of those states in which anti-Semitism is an element of the official domestic and foreign policy. For example, this problem was disregarded completely during the Universal Periodic Review of such states as Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Syria. So the states where anti-Semitism has been manifested in alarming, even genocidal forms and dimensions for decades. During the first two UPRs, specific recommendations relating to the need to fight anti-Semitism have been directed towards 5 states only: Poland, France, Ukraine, Czech Republic, and Lithuania. It is worth noting that among them only France can be considered really as a state facing the problem of the so-called new anti-Semitism, including anti-Israeli hatred. But of course the recommendations didn't even mention that. On the other hand, it is important to consider the way in which Israel actions and human rights standards and record have been evaluated by other states within the UPR process. Israel remains one of the top states which have received by now the highest number of recommendations under UPR. In the course of the first 2 cycles of UPR, Israel received 424 recommendations compared to 534 received by Cuba, 436 by North Korea, 422 by China. And following Israel's decision of March 2012 to stop all contacts with the Human Rights Council, Israel did not attend the original session of the second UPR, but eventually it attended it and participated in its UPR rescheduled for October 2014. And let me now present an overview, a very brief overview of recommendations received by Israel in the second UPR, also in confrontation with recommendations received by some of the states that most harshly criticized Israel. Okay, so can you hear? Yeah, but this is more to see. So these are some of the recommendations Israel received in 2014. As you can see, like give up racist and discriminatory laws and practices, put an end to the process of expanding colonies, to the racial discrimination, etc. Prohibit policies and practices of racial segregation. And when such an accusation comes from South Africa, it also bears a special meaning. This is from Libya, and one of my favorites, mainstream the principle of non-discrimination and equality, from Saudi Arabia. This is about the obligations of the occupying power, and then Cuba put an end to the military attacks against the civilian population, the practice of targeted killings, torture, Palestine, and then Syria, release all Arab prisoners and ensure that they are treated in accordance with international humanitarian law and international human rights law.
When was that? 2013.
But it happens every year, 3 times a year.
Yes, it's all the time the same. Now, Saudi Arabia again, really active, guarantee the enjoyment of all Palestinians with their culture, social and religious rights. Saudi Arabia, yeah. Venezuela, stop the colonization, etc. Again, Saudi Arabia. Implement immediately all United Nations resolutions, particularly those of Human Rights Council. Qatar and the policy of Judaizing Jerusalem. Then just as a comparison, what these states are recommending each other. So Cuba recommends to Saudi Arabia to continue the study of and the necessary measures to create an adequate climate as to the access to international human rights instruments to which the country is not yet state party. Then Palestine on the importance of civil society. Kuwait, also interesting. Pakistan, provide a fair judicial process for female domestic workers who commit crimes punishable under the Saudi law. Oman, again on women's rights, very interesting. And now recommendations for Iran. The recommendation Iran received from Sudan: continue defending the right of its people to address the imposed economic sanctions. And this is also one of my favorites. Russian Federation, continue the work which has been started on the improvement of the conditions of detention in the penitentiary system and the integration of former prisoners into society. There are very interesting documentaries on the conditions in Russian prisons and the way the former prisoners are being reintroduced to the society. I highly recommend them. I think that anyone who watches them will abstain and will never commit any crime in Russia ever. And then Oman, continue to support the to empower women in public life. So this is just a very brief presentation of or an example of how it really looks like. But this is actually a sad conclusion because this is about human rights, and this sounds like a comedy more. So some conclusions. There can be no doubts as to the total disproportionality and unfairness of the evaluation of Israel at the UN. The worst human rights violators in the world, governments responsible for the most serious forms of abuse, discrimination, or even crimes against humanity, enthusiastically use the UN platform to fight Israel. On the other hand, their own terrible and frightening record on human rights has been treated with a great dose of understanding and even support from the states that share this different, very original understanding of the nature of human rights. But what is perhaps even more troubling is a rather mild reaction of the leading European democracies that seem to forget to some extent, at least for the time of the Human Rights Council sessions, how much they care about, among other human rights, the principle of equality between women and men, LGBT rights, fighting racism, including anti-Semitism, etc. For everyone who is engaged in the topic of international system of human rights protection and human rights law, it is clear that Israel violates human rights, not only of the Palestinians but also of Israelis, as all states in the world do. For every such violation, it should be held responsible, and there are proper legal mechanisms, both in the domestic and international law, to assert such responsibility. At the same time, the level of bias, hatred, and injustice faced by Israel on the international arena creates an impression that Israel is the worst human rights violator in the world. In consequence, such an evil state should be pushed outside the scope of international community. Actually, it should not exist at all. The treatment of Israel in the UN and in the Human Rights Council in particular may lead to a sad conclusion that the system of UPR does not work. Actually, it must lead to such conclusion. Its main aim, which is a proper evaluation of how particular states are implementing internationally recognized and binding standards of human rights protection, has not been achieved. Worse even, the results of this evaluation, to a large extent, are being forged, looking, for example, at the recommendations received by Saudi Arabia during UPR on women's rights. One may get an impression that, well, yes, there is something wrong with women's rights in Saudi Arabia, but not that they are being violated to the extreme. It is thus crucial for the governments that are truly concerned about human rights to name expressly the true worst human rights violators by their name, and not to allow a campaign of hatred, discrimination, and defamation being conducted against Israel under the auspices of the organization that emerged from the ashes of the Holocaust. Thank you.